So this is lesson 8, and what we're basically doing is researching our pergola. And last day we left off with basically the 4 posts and where they sit on the or reside on the deck. Today I'm going to be looking at some of the other features. So these in here are basically the different end cuts that we have for the project. And when we're looking at end cuts, they're specific profiles. And these profiles, you may choose one, but then it should be laid out on a grid of graph paper. And that way it allows us to accurately locate or identify how we're going to draw this particular element and to a particular scale. Remember, a contractor's got to rebuild exactly what you're drawing draw the profile on the actual piece of wood. Now, some of the things are pretty easy to cut. Other ones are a bit more difficult. Like this is a difficult cut to do because you cut in, and then you have to chamfer in between, and you're going to have to chip away some wood. So again, something like that, not a very good cut. This we can easily cut to a round and then cut in, and there will be just a little bit of a requirement for chiseling away at something like that. So we'd really like to be able to come up with some sort of profile that's an easy cut. This is difficult where we start right off of the end. We need to basically have some straight portion and then a curve of some sort. And that's an easier cut and it's more consistent down the line. Some of these are very elaborate and you want to stay away from it because it's just adding cost to a project that's not needed. So we're going to be looking at end cuts and end cut examples. And then these here are all braces. So a brace is a method of being able to reduce the span of the beam. And there's different sort of recognized braces. And once again, you put it on graph paper and you have some sort of consistency with the distances that are here, whether they be 2 by 2 or 2 by 4 or something of that nature. It doesn't matter, but you try to be a bit more consistent with the edges. So we're going to look at a bunch of examples, and I'll give you the pros and cons to it. This, even though it looks like it's coming off a beam up in here, it's strictly decorative. I'm going to just change the color here for a second and get something that's a bit more visible in our project. Let's see, show property bar. There we go. So for this guy in here, I'm just going to have something that hopefully the red will show up a bit stronger in terms of color. So this brace in here is strictly decorative. It doesn't really provide much support whatsoever in that location and barely anything in that location. So it's not a very good type of brace. This is obviously a very strong brace, but it doesn't have a mortar or tenon joint in between here, which means one piece of wood is inside of the other and really providing an edge. It's relying primarily on the hardware. So the hardware itself must be able to identify that it can provide that support. You can see it down in here, and that's supporting the beam. And then this over here, this is strictly decorative. It's only supporting basically a ceiling joist, which is no weight whatsoever. So it's not a very good example of a brace. You don't need that one. This one's a better one. But this is a mechanical means of attachment, and it's a slightly nicer look. It's a wrought iron type of look to it. But again, it's just another style. This is using timber, which is similar to the post or the same as the post, and just cut at diagonals. There may be a mortise or tenon joint in there. It's hard to tell by that picture. And then in here, we're looking at the next parts of it and post connections. So what are we doing with the post? Are we cutting down the post and letting the beam sit on top of it or the lintel sit on it? And this is where I use that example. That this is a very good example because all of this portion is supported on the actual, sorry about that, is actually supported right on the post, and then the individual screws in this particular case, or dowels, they look very small in proportion, simply hold it in place without having any load on it. So that dowel has no load on it. All of the load, the transference is occurring right there. So that's a good design. And then up here we have the ceiling joist. Now I'm questioning this only because it looks like part of this, the lower part, is notched on the ceiling joist and the upper part is notched on the lintel. We never do that. That really deteriorates the quality of the lintel, although this looks like oak, which is far stronger than anything that we're going to be using for our particular application. Here's another brace, and this is one that I've selected for my own project. I like this profile. I've changed it a bit, made it a bit more mine, and therefore as we go through the design or the research, you got to find an image that actually matches or is something that's accommodating to you. Now, even though these are heavier timbers, I like this sort of notched look up in here, and I like this. So I'm using this on my project. You don't have to, obviously. You're not being marked on whether you like what I like. It's more of what's consistent within your project. So again, a different brace. This is using a completely different post construction. The post and beam in here has a mortise and tenon within it, so each slide in each other. But this itself is a timber frame design, so we can't really use that one in this case. Here's one that it's actually showing us an example, oh, I apologize for that, of how this is put together. I'm just going to roll that up a bit in here. So it's actually showing the portion of the wood that is recessed into the beam and the portion of the wood that's recessed into the post. Now, I liked a lot of this, but I found that I didn't like this edge in here, so I actually took mine and I drew a straight line in here, and I drew a straight line in here to, oh, sorry about that. I drew a straight line in there, and I cut this off, but basically I'm using a very similar style in here, mortise and tenon. And if you actually do the measurements in here, this says 3 foot. You can't do anything greater than 2 foot by 2 foot according to the Ontario Building Code to provide that brace. Here's another series of examples of the end profiles and what they're cut like. You have all sorts of choices to come up with. This catalog I found, which is difficult to read, the actual image quality is very, very poor, but again, it's got an extensive amount of different profiles, and try to stick to something that you find online, how the actual ends look. Now, I brought this example up not for any other reason other than this. This example shows that the actual beam, which could be 2-ply, is actually sitting right on the post, and that's possible too. I mean, you can notch that out. You can use basically a chainsaw and cut that area out and put the post or the beam right inside of it, and then you can actually see here very, very closely there's these dowels that will support it all. So again, this is an excellent way of supporting a beam on a post, and I like this adaptation, although I didn't use it in my particular project. And then the ceiling beams are on top, and then it's got a secondary set of lattice work, which you can do on yours as well. And the idea is to explore and examine what other people have done. In this particular example, once again, the ceiling joist is notched. The beam is not. This is obviously the beam. They're using these mechanical means of attaching to provide all of the weight transference. I'm not a fond proponent of that, only because I'm really relying on a device and bolts to transfer that load. I'd much rather have this whole thing sit right on the beam. So if I notch this out, that makes a bit more sense to me. I'm very particular when it comes to how this is adapted, but this is a look. Somebody liked that look, and that's what they went with. And then they've decoratively bolted in this beam or the ceiling joist at the top. That's absolutely unnecessary. It's way too, it's a bit of overkill there, but it's a decorative element, and that's why they've actually done it. They can't do that detail anywhere else, but they've done it for these two pieces being attached on either side of the post, and that's fine. I mean, again, it's a decorative feature more than anything else. Now the base. When we're looking at the base of a post, it's an ugly connection, and if you actually see the connector that's going to be there, the metal connection, depending on how it goes through the deck, you want to cover it up. This is using a very basic shoe mold, which is a common term for any sort of carpentry. And it's a common profile that you can cut and finish off the bottom, so as the decking comes underneath it, it gives you a nicer finish. And then we progress to like a baseboard casement, which is a taller item. Again, it looks a bit more decorative. It's nicer. It's a more finished look for your deck. And again, you can get matching wood to what you've been using on your project. This is the top of a more decorative piece, and you can see in here the different layers of wood that are applied in order to make this look. And then they have a finishing layer outside of that. Oops, sorry about that. And then they've provided another layer even more so on top of that to give that depth of look. And this is the base of it. They've done something very similar. Now, this is a very simple cut. I mean, it's a 45-degree angle cut. It's not very sophisticated. The edges are shown. I don't recommend something like that because it actually looks, you hate to use the term, but cheap. And it could have been done much nicer, and especially with the profiles that are available at your local hardware store, it could have finished that piece off very nicely. I'm just going to zoom out of this one in here. As I start looking at examples, I start looking at better ones. Sorry, I zoomed out a bit too far. And here, again, it's a series of applied woods. So this board here was simply applied on top of the post and then mitered on the edge. And then on top of that piece, these pieces were then applied on top of mitered. And then this is a picture mold, and it was simply designed to hide that crease or the corner where that piece of wood meets that one. So realistically, these look like 2x4s, and then those are just planks, 1x8s or 1x10 planks. And then they've done the same down here, only with the design of this nature, the two are almost identical. You've got basically your 2x4, which looks like it's in both of these, and then you've got your shoe mold or picture frame mold that's just sitting on top of it. But what it does is it nicely sort of decorates the base of the post and gives more volume to it. I've done things like this. Now just imagine the post coming right through it, extremely decorative, and you know, if it matches the architecture of the house, it's beautiful. And all these are layers of wood. So you have one layer of wood. Let's see if I can represent that in here. Sorry about that. We have one layer of wood there, and that basically boxes the post. And then we have another layer of wood on the outside that is framing the post. And then we use a picture frame mold to frame the inside of the post. So that's all it is layers upon layers of wood. And then they've used a shoe mold at the top and one at the bottom, so it's reflected at both ends. And then they capped it off with just some straight pieces of wood on top, which they've notched out the actual post. And then again, they've used a picture frame mold along the top, which is the same as what they have on the inset. So it's layers of wood, and this adds to the sort of aesthetic value in terms of the detail of the actual post. Now, you know, we're talking about a pergola, but a pergola and an arbor or swinging arbor in this particular case, there's not too much difference from them. It's just the size. So even though you do research on pergolas, you could do research on arbors and still get some of the same type of details that you could use for your own project. And that's all these are layers of wood on top of wood. So the basic post and beam construction is the same. And then you add these layers, these decorative features, for the purposes of the look. And you can see how they've matched the detail up here with the detail down on the ceiling joist, even though the two pieces of wood are a different size. Now here's a trick. If you find that you can use a 2x6 lintel or a double ply or 2-ply beam, which is a lintel, in your construction, what you can do is actually purchase one that's much bigger, like a 2x10, and actually cut out a very long sweeping arc like that. As long as this middle distance is that minimum distance requirement, you can easily take larger pieces and put in these sweeping arcs, which really add to the dramatic effect of the look of the project and add to the quality of your sort of craftsmanship in this particular element. So these are all the different pictures that I would go through, do some research. Now, if this was for a client, I'd be showing them this, saying, do you like that? Do you like this? And then marking what they actually like. They like this detail. They like this detail. And making sure I got a series of notes. And then trying to replicate that in CAD. That's sort of the approach you take whenever you're doing any research on a particular part of your deck construction.